All right, folks, good afternoon. Welcome. This is our second last talk of the day here at the McCain Health and Wellness Talks Center. This is in association with ProVeg International. Our last talk will start at 3. That'll be with Kaylin Novak, and she'll be talking generally about plant-based protein. Right now, a more general discussion around sustainable nutrition, a plant-based diet, and how that is good for you as an individual and for the planet as a whole. We're doing this with Dr Nanine Wyma. Good afternoon and welcome. The stage is yours, Doc.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think I've got double mics here, so I'll just stand here. Thank you everybody for being here today. It's really nice to see so many faces in the audience, and it's also really great to be at the Plant Power Show for the second year in a row. It's exciting to see the community get together and grow and share. So I'm looking forward to our presentation today. My presentation is going to be sharing information about, I'm sure that you've heard that plant-based diets are good for the environment. So I will be sharing more just to back up that claim, give you the evidence behind that statement so that you can understand why people say that plant-based diets are good for the environment. So my name is Nanine. I am a medical doctor, and soon after I graduated, I started working in the non-profit world, and we co-founded the Physicians Association for Nutrition, which is known as PAN, the National South African office, and I am the managing director there. This photo here is from the United Nations Climate Change Conference last year, where I was working at one of the first ever food systems pavilions in the climate change conference and conversation. So just to justify that I do know a little bit what I'm talking about, and I have exchanged on this topic on a global level. And my outline for the presentation will be a little bit of an introduction about our organization and what we do in South Africa. And then we will look at the science behind why people choose a plant-based diet. Also, who is recommending that we eat a plant-based diet or less meat in general, and can we trust those recommendations? And then we'll go into the different ways that we can unpack the environmental impact of our food choices. So that's our greenhouse gas emissions, land use, deforestation, water, eutrophication is a type of water pollution, and then we'll move into how this actually applies in the real world. So starting off with the Physicians Association for Nutrition, PAN International was started in Germany in 2018. It is a fast-growing health and medical non-profit organization, and we raise awareness of the role of whole food plant-based nutrition for health prevention, health promotion, and disease prevention among healthcare professionals, students, and policymakers. PAN is in 12 countries and also has university groups at 25 universities. And our work in South Africa at our national office is we have our own unique program. So we do 3 different programs. The first one is research, where we apply plant-based nutrition concepts specifically into the South African population, because we are a very unique population and we would like to translate that into our context. And then we have the journal series, which is a CPD accredited program for licensed healthcare professionals to read the latest evidence-based information on plant-based healthcare and receive CPD points at the same time. And we also have our university groups, which we launched this year. I know the little dots are quite small, but you can see we have 3 university groups. They are based at the University of Stellenbosch, University of Cape Town, and also Pretoria. And we co-host monthly activities with our students, including educational lectures, which is really the foundation of the program, and then also film screenings and social events. And it goes without saying, there's a lot of free, delicious plant-based food that we share with them. So now you understand that my background is in healthcare and medicine, and I'm talking about sustainability. So why is it important for health science students and professionals to understand why people choose plant-based diets for the environment? Well, firstly, we don't believe that we should be telling anybody how to eat. Of course, healthcare professionals give advice, but our patients and the general public is free to make up their own decision about how they want to eat and what they want to eat. And more and more people in the world are choosing a plant-based diet for environmental reasons. So our role as healthcare professionals is really to usher that transition in the most healthy way possible. Because as we've seen, it's not always, vegan doesn't always equal healthy. So we want to see how we can maximize the potential health benefits of this plant-rich diet. And we also know that we've seen in international groups, but we've also proven in South Africa that our education system for medical professionals does not share information about plant-based nutrition. So if you go to your doctor, your dietitian, the odds are that they're probably not going to know much about plant-based nutrition. And we confirmed this gap in education in South Africa, where we did a social media survey. We had over 170 responses from undergraduate medical and dietetic students. And there were a lot of findings, but I'd just like to share this one, which is that 74% of our South African medical students said that they didn't learn enough about nutrition. So this is a gap that we know is an issue in South Africa, and we are here to fill that gap. Okay. Everything that I do is very science-based, it's very evidence-based. That comes from my background in medicine. So all the claims that I make are going to be backed up by some kind of scientific study. And this is the first one. So we see more and more people are choosing a plant-based diet. Let's look at the reasons why people choose a plant-based diet. And this information is going to come from an evidence map where they looked at all the studies in the whole world that analyze why people choose a plant-based diet, and they mapped it out. And this is a very complicated slide, so just allow me to interpret it for you. What they did is they found that the motivations for choosing a plant-based diet either fit into health or ethical or other, but health and ethical were the majority. Under health, there was health and weight, and under ethical, it was balanced between animal welfare and environmental concern as the two predominant ethical reasons why people choose a plant-based diet. And all of those bubbles on the left-hand side, I'm going to explain how we've interpreted that. Basically, the people who choose a plant-based diet for health reasons are more likely to be semi-vegetarian or flexitarian. And those who choose plant-based diets for ethical reasons, such as animal welfare or environment, they're more likely to be vegans that don't ever kind of stray from the spectrum of plant-based diets. They're all the way on the end of the spectrum. So that helps us understand our community and the different motivations and how they follow their diet. And it also shows that a significant portion of people are choosing a plant-based diet for environmental reasons. Okay, so who is recommending that we eat less meat? And can we trust these recommendations? Where do they come from? Well, firstly, I'm going to present the planetary health diet. This plate model was published by the Eat Lancet Commission on Healthy Diets from Sustainable Food Systems. And they were a group of scientists that asked the question, how can we transform the food system into something that is healthy and sustainable? And their results were that we have to decrease our red meat and sugar consumption by 50%, and also increase our plant-based food consumption by 100%. And this plate model that they described, I'm not sure the text might be a bit small, but the red sliver that's kind of at the 3 o'clock is animal sourced protein. And the light blue is dairy. So what we learned from this plate model is that it is still possible to eat a sustainable diet by eating some animal products. But it is a very small portion. And the portion of fruits and vegetables, which is half the plate, and all the other plant-based sources of food should far outweigh the animal-based foods that you're eating. So usually, for example, if you eat a burger it's going to be like a piece of bread and a nice juicy beef patty and then a piece of bread. That beef takes up 50% portion of your plate. Here we see that portion is supposed to be much, much smaller if you want to eat a sustainable and healthy diet. Next, we have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the IPCC. The IPCC is a group of scientists that comes together every year, and they publish books and books of the latest science on climate change. They are pretty much the top level of authority when it comes to science and climate change. And this graph that they've given, the x-axis, so the bottom axis, and the bars, they are the greenhouse gas mitigation potential, which means that the bigger the graph, the more potential there is to avoid climate change. So on the y-axis is the spectrum of plant-based diets. And as we move up, we're reducing animal products by a little bit until we get to the top where there's no animal-based foods. And that has the biggest potential to avoid global warming, is to eat a vegan diet that has no animal-based foods. What is important about this graph is to understand and appreciate that every step you take counts. And you don't have to go from a completely omnivorous diet to a completely vegan diet to make a change, because every piece that you eliminate from your diet is going to avoid climate change in a little bit. So that is the takeaway message, that every step counts. So those are the two bodies, one that is more focused on health and sustainable diets, and the next one focused on climate change, that you can absolutely trust, and they recommend that you should eat more plant-based foods and less animal-based foods. And here I'm going to go into a little bit more also of a sciencey approach of how does the food system impact the environment. And it's quite complex. When we talk about global warming, we think about greenhouse gas emissions. And yes, the food system accounts for 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. There's also other factors to look at, such as land use, water pollution, and biodiversity. They need to be all put together to get a bigger picture of what is the environmental impact. And I'll talk about each one of them except for the biodiversity. So I'll just touch on it now. 94% of all of the mammals in the world are livestock, are cows that we are breeding for food. So 95% of all mammals are now livestock. And about the same with birds. 70% of all birds on the planet are chickens that we breed for food. So our animals that we are breeding for food are really taking up all the space and dominating the biodiversity that we have on the planet. And if that's something that you're interested in, I really recommend that you watch some of David Attenborough's documentaries, because he speaks on this topic very, very well. And he shared that even throughout his lifetime, he's seen how the biodiversity has really collapsed and become a lot less. And this is one of my favorite graphs. So this graph is the greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of protein. I've decided to use per 100 grams of protein because we are all extremely concerned about getting enough protein. I think it's everybody just worries about protein. And this is in carbon dioxide equivalents. So this is like the carbon footprint of that food per 100 grams of protein. And I would like to compare the animal-based sources of protein to the plant-based sources of protein. So at the top we see beef, which is more than double any other food or source of protein's climate footprint or carbon footprint. And then there goes beef, lamb. Don't worry about tomatoes because nobody eats tomatoes for protein. Prawns, beef, cheese, and then a little bit down there's milk, pig meat, poultry meat, eggs. Those are the animal-based sources of protein. And then when we look at the plant-based sources of protein, they are right at the bottom, the last two, which is peas and nuts. So By far, beef has the biggest climate impact, the biggest carbon footprint, and plant-based foods have a very, very small carbon footprint per 100 grams of protein. And if there was one thing that you wanted to do to reduce your carbon footprint, and you only wanted to take one step, and you thought, okay, I only want to cut one animal product out my diet to reduce my carbon footprint, I'm going to take eggs out of my diet. And you look at this graph and see that eggs really relatively don't have such a high carbon footprint. If you wanted to cut one thing out of your diet to reduce your carbon footprint, beef would be the most effective way to reduce your carbon footprint. This graph is really complicated, and I don't expect you to be able to read what's going on. But this graph answers the question that a lot of people will ask about plant-based foods and the plant-based food industry. A lot of people will argue, okay, well, the peas are grown in South Africa, and then the peas are shipped to Canada for processing, and then they're shipped to China for packaging, and then they're shipped back to South Africa. Doesn't that have a really high carbon footprint because they're flying these ingredients all around the world? Well, this graph looks at the carbon footprint across the entire supply chain. So we go from farm to fork. And the red portion is the transportation. And you can barely see the red portion on this graph. The parts that you can see that you might think is red is actually orange. And by far, the greatest environmental impact comes from the green and brown portions, which are the on-farm practices. So just to answer that question, no, shipping your plant-based ingredients around the world does not have a significant carbon footprint. And actually, eating local does not have a low carbon footprint. There are benefits to eating local, such as food security, especially in the cases of supply chain disruption, which is very real crisis that we have with the wars going on. But no, eating local doesn't have a lower carbon footprint. Okay. So now I will talk about a topic that I thought was very interesting when I started learning about this information. And that is the amount of land that is required to produce that piece of beef or steak at the end of the day. So animals require, and beef and livestock require, a large amount of land to be able to roam around. And not only do they require that land, but they also require another portion of land where they are growing maize and soy to be food for the animals. So a lot of land is being cleared to feed animals, and that food is going to animals and it's not going to humans. So instead of the humans being fed with crops, the animals are fed with crops, and this is actually a very inefficient way of using our natural resources. In order to be able to create that land, this is what drives deforestation. And this graph says what are the drivers of tropical deforestation, and the greatest driver is beef. And if you are very concerned about the Amazon, that is the darkest portion red, which is Brazilian beef, but also Africa. Right at the top of that bar is the amount of deforestation that happens in Africa for African beef. And this just touches on the amount of water that is required for agriculture. A significant amount of our natural water resources goes towards our food production, and 70% of all fresh water withdrawals goes to agriculture. And also agriculture is the greatest cause for eutrophication, which is a type of water pollution. At the farms, the runoff of the water is very nutrient dense, and it ends up in the water. And it, you know, when the water goes like really green and there's the algal bloom, that is what eutrophication is. And our animal agriculture systems are the biggest driver for eutrophication. This is the same type of graph, fresh water withdrawals per 100 grams of protein. And at the top, we see cheese and nuts are the biggest culprits for water consumption. So that's why it is important to look at this through many different perspectives, not just greenhouse gas emissions, because we saw that nuts have really low greenhouse gas emissions, but here we see actually they require a whole lot of water. So there's more to environmental impact than just greenhouse gas emissions. And essentially, we are looking at 100 grams of protein, so cheese and nuts are at the top, and right at the bottom are other pulses and peas, and those are your plant-based sources of protein. So we see our legumes and peas and beans and plant-based proteins really coming out to be having the least environmental impact from all of the different perspectives we've looked at thus far. And that was a lot of science, a lot of graphs. How does this actually translate into the real world? How does this apply to the food that you eat every day and the choices that you make? And I'll start off by comparing dairy and plant milks. And these graphs look at our 5 most common types of milks that we drink. Number 1, dairy. And the 4 plant milks that are most common is soya, rice, almond, and oat milk. And this looks at the different dimensions of land use. I'll start there. So dairy milk requires the most amount of land. We can expect that. Greenhouse gas emissions, dairy milk also comes way out on top. Fresh water, there's dairy milk, and the second one is almond milk, because we now know that nuts have a very high water footprint. And eutrophication, also dairy milk has the highest impact. So this is just to put it into perspective. And it's important to understand that young people who want to have a low environmental impact, who really care about the planet and climate change, when they see graphs like this, they go, okay, well, it's just that simple. I'm not going to have dairy milk. And it's this kind of information that drives those changes. So that's why how we understand why people choose the options that they choose. This is another example. This was at the UN Climate Change Conference a couple years ago, COP26 in Glasgow. And they did a carbon footprint of each of their meals on the menu. And the one with the lowest carbon footprint was the mushroom burger in the bottom right. And the one with the highest carbon footprint was the beef burger. This is a really easy way to communicate what the carbon footprint of your food is and what the environmental impact is. And hopefully in the future, we will have more foods being labeled with the carbon footprint so that we can all understand what the carbon footprint of the food that is being served is. And finally, I will take this into also a real life application of schools in Brazil that implemented a sustainable school program. This was in the public schools in Brazil, which is really impressive. And the sustainable food program was implemented, sustainable school program was implemented in 155 public schools. It reached over 32,000 students, and they implemented low carbon meals, which is plant-based meals, and they only did it 2 times a week. And these were the results. In 2019, they swapped out 2 days a week of meals, and they were able to reduce their carbon footprint by 15 to 17%. In 2020, they aimed to swap out 3 days of meals, and then in 2021, 4 days of meals. So technically, if they had swapped out 4 days of meals for plant-based, they would have reduced their food-related carbon footprint by 40 to 45%. And that is really significant. So in conclusion, the takeaway messages that I hope that you can appreciate from this presentation is that small steps do make a difference. You don't need to take an extreme approach. And also, if you want to do one thing, then cutting out or reducing beef would be the most effective way to reduce your food-related carbon footprint. Also, all plant milks are more environmentally friendly than dairy milk, no matter which lens you look at it through. And to eat more legumes. Legumes are really the most amazing superfood of the future. They have a low carbon footprint, they have a low water footprint, and they're also incredibly high in fiber. So there's a lot of health benefits to eating more legumes as well. And this is something that we always recommend that people start with, is learn how to bring in more legumes, as in lentils, chickpeas, beans into your diet, and learn to prepare those meals in a way that is delicious for you. And that is the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for listening. And if you do want to give feedback, we would appreciate it. You can just scan that QR code.
Dr. Nanine Wyma, that is wonderful. Great insights. Are there any questions? Anybody that has a question that perhaps wasn't answered in the presentation? Nope. That means you did a fantastic job. Well done.
Lots of information.
Thank you very, very much. A round of applause for
Thank you very
her,
much.
please.
Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you.